Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to our panel discussion today, talking about balancing the difficulties of administering an election in the face of a global health crisis while also protecting the right of all voters to be able to safely vote. We are really lucky to be joined by our wonderful panelists, Professor Rick Hasson and Professor Ned Foley. My name is Katie Shanahan. I'm the co-president of the ACS Lawyer Chapter in Columbus, Ohio. In my professional setting, I'm the Ohio State Director for All on the Line, which is a grassroots advocacy campaign that is on an effort to end gerrymandering. So this is actually relevant to some of my work, so I'm really excited too that we could be broadcasting this virtually so that folks from across the country can be joining us. I want to also give a special shout out to all of the lawyer chapters and student chapters from across the country who joined us as co-sponsors. So I'm going to try, I hope that I've made an exhaustive list on this sheet of paper, but if I forgot you, my deepest apologies. But the lawyer chapters in Madison, Northeast Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, the Bay Area, Chicago, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, Georgia, Knoxville, Colorado, the Minneapolis-St. Paul lawyer chapters. Thank you all so much for boosting up this event and sharing it with your networks. We're so glad that we could do this in the virtual space so that more folks can join in on the conversation. One quick note as a reminder, ACS is a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization. The organization does not take positions on candidates for public office, pending legislation, or judicial nominees, though we will be talking about some pending legislation, but the views expressed here are not those of ACS officially, so just a quick legal reminder. And I also wanted to give a reminder about how you can ask questions. Please do throughout the event. There are two ways to do it. You can either do it by entering a Q&A or in the chat box. Both of those are down at the bottom of your screen on the Zoom video window. So feel free to put in questions there. We'll have some time at the end to answer those questions. So we look forward to hearing those from you all at the end of the conversation. So when Carly Edelstein and I, who's my other co-president of the Columbus Lawyer Chapter, we're thinking about programs that we wanted to host. We were just coming off of the Ohio primary, which was originally scheduled for St. Patrick's Day on March 17th. And our in-person voting got canceled finally with a decision by the Ohio Supreme Court just 3 hours before polls were meant to open. And there was a long afternoon and evening of confusion for poll workers and voters and advocacy organizations alike about whether or not we would actually be voting in person. Ultimately, we did not. We then got an extension for our vote-in system, although for a state that primarily votes in person on election day, boosting a vote-by-mail system in just 5 weeks was not all that successful. We had pretty abysmal turnout in this primary election, lots of factors going in there, but certainly trying to administer a brand new vote-by-mail system didn't help. But also the primary election in Wisconsin, where voters were forced to vote in person on election day, unfortunately, and lots of folks missing out on the opportunity to mail in ballots because they didn't get them in time, and other difficulties made abundantly clear just how impactful the coronavirus has been on not only all aspects of our lives, but certainly in our ability to administer safe elections and for voters to participate in them. And so we wanted to have a conversation about how states can and should be preparing to host safe elections in November. Lots of conversation around this area. And so we thought, well, we have to get two leading experts in the field with Professors Hasson and Foley. We're so glad that they could join us today. So first, thank you both so much for joining us in this conversation. Really looking forward to talking with you both about this important issue. So I first wanted to talk about, late last week, the US House passed the HEROES Act, which was a $3 trillion stimulus package that included, among a number of other provisions, provisions specifically geared towards supporting states to facilitate election administration and ballot access issues for November's election. with the interest of helping states administer a much more robust vote-by-mail system than most states engage in under normal circumstances. So I'm wondering if you two could talk about what major highlights you saw as being included in that bill, if there were any major provisions that you think are really important that didn't make it in there, and most importantly, as the bill now moves to the US Senate, where it has a much more difficult path to passage, I'm wondering if you can highlight what you think the absolute most important provisions are to make it out of that federal stimulus package, particularly as states are looking at considerable budget gaps and maybe facing their own problems in being able to fund those provisions. So it doesn't matter to me which one of you goes first, but would love to hear both of your thoughts.
Well, I'll just jump in with the word budget and money, because I think the most important thing the federal government could do is provide states with money. And I think the risk is if the progressive groups overreach and produce a backlash in the Senate in terms of reacting negatively to proposals, you could get gridlock, which we've seen both at the federal level and the state level. So I think the goal here is what's good enough, not perfection, and the goal is just to get enough money and enough logistical capacity to actually pull off the November election without going for the gold standard. And I think that means giving as much money as possible to states and then letting the states use it without a lot of strings attached.
So first, let me say thank you for having me, and shout out to Carly, who's a UCI Law alumna, and that's how I got connected to this event. So hello, Columbus. Glad to be with you. I think you're going to find that Ned and I are going to agree on a lot, and this is the first thing that we agree on. The first stimulus bill came up with $400 million for COVID-related election relief. It requires states to come up with a 20% match of that money, which is proving to be difficult, not only because states are financially strapped, as you mentioned, Katie, but also because some state legislatures are not meeting in session because of the pandemic, and so they haven't been able to logistically do what they need to do to take that money. The Bipartisan Policy Center said that the total amount that's due is $1.5 billion in terms of extra costs related to running an election. That this is for extra scanners, printing more ballots, dealing with staff, making polling places safer for people who are doing in-person voting. The Brennan Center had the number $2 billion. I've now seen figures as high as $4 billion. Here's the reality. There's going to be much more vote by mail in the fall, assuming that we're in the same health situation as we are right now. There's going to be much more of it. And if it's not paid for by the federal government, it's going to be paid for, at least in part, by state governments. And state governments are strapped right now for obvious reasons with what's going on with the pandemic. And if there's not enough money, that means that things are going to be done in a sloppy way, or they're going to be done cutting corners. And that raises questions about the integrity of the election, and it raises questions about voter confidence. Ned and I were both involved in a committee that issued a report worried about voter confidence in the fall. That report, you can find it by Googling fair elections during a crisis. And we bipartisan committee that issued a number of recommendations on these things, and one of those is adequate funding. So funding is the top of the list. I too agree with Ned that the Democrats overreached the first time. And if you look at like the Wyden-Klobuchar bill, which was the Senate side of things, not only did it call for every state to be required to offer a vote by mail option without an excuse, it made it required in perpetuity. That is right. It wasn't just for the pandemic. And I think that, now is not the time to be trying to make major changes in policy. We need to get through the next 7 months. And so I think that was a big mistake. If what they're trying to do is not message, but actually get something passed. It triggered Trump's reaction saying that, no Republicans could ever get elected if the Democrats' bill passed, which is preposterous. But vote by mail has become a more politicized issue. And I think taking steps that are more middle of the road and reasonable would be a better way towards legislative compromise. Money's got to be the bottom line, most important thing, though.
Thank you both. So I agree that money is going to be the biggest challenge. I'm working here in Ohio trying to get some of the same provisions in place for our November election, and it's something that we're hearing on the ground often, not unsurprisingly, from legislators who are a little nervous about anything that has a money ask attached to it. But obviously some really important provisions there to make sure that our system is successful in November. So I want to switch to talking more about the different roles that different groups of people are playing in these conversations as we're looking to moving November to a much more robust vote by mail system. And I think that there are two major groups who are sometimes at odds, one being attorneys, the other being election administrators. Administrators obviously thinking about logistically how they can pull off a much more robust vote by mail system. A lot of attorneys involved in cases across the country now, making sure that voters actually have access to the ballot in a fair and accessible way. And on a recent podcast, Professor Foley, you suggested that it would make sense for lawyers to get out of the way of election administrators so that they can figure out how to logistically carry out the elections, and that there may be an interference with some of the litigation. So I'm wondering if you can talk more about that, but for both of you to talk about what the balance is in the lawsuits that are attempting to expand ballot access, to expand who, for example, can vote by mail, or if there are other barriers to vote by mail, getting those taken out, but also in understanding the logistical, not complications, but where there are, maybe complications is the right word, where there are logistic boundaries about what administrators can actually do to carry out the election.
Yeah, so I think there can be litigation overreach like legislative overreach. You know, I think we need to be careful and hopefully nuanced about this. Some litigation can be constructive, particularly if it's brought early enough in the process so that it doesn't destabilize the operation of the election. Now, of course, sometimes you have to sue in the middle of the voting process because of changed conditions that occur, as in Wisconsin. But, you know, depending upon the nature of the claims brought, that can, so for example, mentioning Wisconsin again, I think the district court was well-intentioned to try to expand beyond the remedy that the plaintiffs initially sought to deal with the problem of the fact that the absentee voters were not getting the ballots that they had themselves requested and were entitled to have. And the district judge was correct that the plaintiff's remedy, in a sense, wasn't good enough for what the plaintiffs was asking for, and that there needed to be a better remedy. But the problem with it, the remedy that the district judge came up with, well-intentioned and on the fly, was exactly what got the majority of the US Supreme Court upset and led to this, you know, 5-4 decision. So, you know, hindsight's always 20/20, and I'm reluctant to be unduly critical, but I think there was a different remedy that was never sought in Wisconsin that would at least should be thought about going forward. And if the fear here is disenfranchisement, if what we're concerned about is voters who should be allowed to vote absentee and not face going to polling places and risk their health, we have to ask, what do we do if they don't get the ballot that they're supposed to get when they've done everything right to request it? Simply telling them they can postmark it by election day isn't good enough if they're still not going to get their ballot on election day. So there needs to be some self-help remedy, an emergency backup. You know, if a polling place, if the machines break down in a polling places are supposed to have emergency backup ballots, like a provisional ballot or something. Well, there needs to be an emergency backup form of an absentee ballot. Turns out that exists for overseas and military voters as a matter of federal law. It's called the FWAB, F-W-A-B, Federal Write-In Absentee Ballot. That doesn't exist for domestic absentee voters. Again, it shouldn't be something legislated by Congress for eternity, but maybe it is something that we need just for this November in the midst of a pandemic. So I would distinguish sort of smart, narrowly tailored litigation that could be constructive from other forms of litigation that can actually be counterproductive, again, partly because of overreaching.
So I think that, while I don't necessarily agree that lawyers should be suing early and often, I certainly agree they should be suing early. The message from the Supreme Court consistently over the last decade, including in the controversial ruling in the Wisconsin case, was don't wait until just before the election as a court to grant relief. So things have to happen now, which is why I think you're seeing a flood of litigation right now. And there are kind of two clusters of groups that are, well, three clusters of groups that are suing. There are voting rights groups that are bringing lawsuits around the country on things like in Texas, where there's a dispute over whether Texas only has absentee voting if you have a valid excuse, and whether lack of immunity and fear of contracting COVID-19 is a legitimate excuse. So the voting rights group suing, there's the Democratic Party that's suing, and the Democratic Party's lawsuits overlap in some ways with what the voting rights groups are doing. They actually go further, and I think they ask for much more relief in some cases. For example, they're arguing that there's a constitutional right to be able to have a ballot accepted that's postmarked on election day, which is not really a constitutional standard that we've seen before, and not what the Wisconsin case said. They're also arguing there's a constitutional right to have unlimited community collection, sometimes called ballot harvesting, community collection of absentee ballots. And I think that goes too far. So there's the voting rights groups, there's a Democratic Party, and then there are a cluster of right-wing groups like True the Vote, Judicial Watch, PILF, that are suing they're intervening in some of these lawsuits, but they're also suing to try to block the expansion of early voting or expanded absentee balloting. We saw that an unsuccessful effort to raise voter fraud concerns in a Nevada case to stop an all-mail election there, and the trial court said there was no evidence of fraud related to balloting. It's important to have the rules done in advance as much as possible. So I do think that the litigation makes sense. It falls into two clusters. And I should say, I just this morning posted a paper on SSRN about voting rights in a pandemic. If you go to electionlawblog.org, you'll find it near the top, a link to that paper. And there's basically two clusters of cases that we're seeing. One is a cluster of constitutional litigation, where the claim is that either you need to change your existing rules in light of the pandemic, otherwise people are going to be disenfranchised, or a change in the rules that has been put in place because of the pandemic raises constitutional questions. These are typically done under a balancing test, which is known in the election law world as the Anderson-Burdick balancing test for two Supreme Court cases. It's a very amorphous test, and I've been kind of critical of it generally, as has Professor Foley, but besides the US Supreme Court, it's actually the lower courts, conservative and liberal judges have been pretty good at recognizing that the balance needs to be struck differently under the conditions of a pandemic. What might not seem burdensome ordinarily, for example, that you need to have a witness sign your absentee ballot application, or you sign the outside of your absentee ballot envelope, becomes burdensome in a pandemic. The other set of litigation is litigation over statutory interpretation. So the question that's now going to be before the Texas Supreme Court about whether it's a disability under the absentee ballot excuse laws, whether it's a disability that allows you to vote by mail. That's a statutory interpretation question. I argue there that courts should apply this long-standing thumb on the scale, this canon of construction that says, I've called it the democracy canon, that says, when it's a close case of statutory interpretation, an ambiguous statute, interpreted to favor the rights of voters. And so I'm hoping that seems to be what courts have done. For example, the lower court in the Texas case, and also the Oklahoma Supreme Court saying, you don't need a notary. Like, where are you going to find a notary ordinarily? You don't need a notary in the middle of a pandemic in order to be able to vote absentee. But then, of course, the Oklahoma legislature turned around and they reimposed the notary requirement. So I expect we're going to see some constitutional litigation. So we're seeing litigation in both buckets. The early returns on that litigation look pretty good, Wisconsin notwithstanding. I think Wisconsin doesn't look very good, but otherwise things do look pretty good.
Thank you both. So I think the other question about timing is about when boards of elections need to know what changes are going to be made to their system so that they can actually successfully administer the election. It's certainly something that we're running up against here in Ohio as folks who are advocating for changes to our November election. So I'm wondering what you all think our timeline is when, not just in terms of logistically how you can pull off a successful election, but also to your point, Professor Hassan, there's also a public education piece in this conversation, which is ensuring that voters actually know where there are changes, how they can access the ballot box. So I'm curious what you all think our timeline is, if we've hit our time yet, or how much longer we have to implement these changes so that there isn't an interruption in November.
Well, so one thing I'll say is that there are two issues I think rolled into one in your question. Number one is logistically, what's it going to take for election administrators to get it done? So already now's the time to be contacting printers to make sure that, so I think the figure in Georgia is that they have 1.2 million absentee ballot requests in the last election. This is for their primary, which I think has been moved to June, not July. I think it's June. 1.2 million requests compared to 36,000 requests in the last primary election like this. So you have to hire printers. You have to buy scanners. You have to train employees. Now's the time to be doing it. I don't think we're too late, but now is the time. You can't wait till the fall. But the other part that's in your question is about educating voters. And this is a real problem. And, it was a problem. Turnout was really high in Wisconsin, despite all the problems, in part because Democrats were so angry that the election was still going forward. But turnout was, still terrible in Milwaukee, which, as you mentioned, had 175 out of 180 polling places closed. So while turnout among white Democrats was something like 49%, among African-American Democrats was something like 14%, pretty awful numbers. And in Ohio, as you mentioned, that election was less contentious, I think, in part because there wasn't a hot button state Supreme Court race on the ballot like there was in Wisconsin. And you have a Secretary of State in Ohio, Frank LaRose, who seems to be trying to do the right thing, but still the results were pretty disappointing in terms of what they were able to do. And it shows you that you need more lead time. And a big part of that lead time is educating voters. It's not just, is the absentee ballot available? It's people who've never applied for an absentee ballot. Well, do you have to send something back? What do you have to show? When do you have to do it? Do you have to get a stamp? And so, and when judges are coming in and changing the rules, so I think we had the primary changed 3 times in Ohio, or at least 3 attempts to change the time in Ohio, and we had conflicting rulings from courts in Wisconsin up to the day before the election. The Wisconsin election administrators didn't know what to do. Poll workers don't know what to do. Let's not forget, it's not just about the voters themselves, it's the poll workers. Poll workers not showing up. In Chicago, for example, during the Illinois primary, which also took place during the pandemic, they had to kind of deputize anyone on the street to serve as an election judge because they couldn't open their polling places. So we have more lead time to November, but it's not as much time as you might think.
Yeah, the EAC, the Federal Election Assistance Commission, has a good on their website is a calendar for when local officials have to act to do various logistical things. And I think the Brennan Center has picked up on that and maybe expanded upon that. So, I would look to those calendars. I also think we should put on the table the idea of adjusting dates. I'm a little tentative about this, but I'd be interested what you all thought about this, which is the problem that emerged in Wisconsin was the deadline for a voter to request an absentee ballot was unrealistic in light of the volume of requests that Wisconsin was flooded with, and there was just systemic overload. As we plan for November, one question is, who assumes the risk of delay, whether it's the post office's delay or whether it's the election administrator's delay? To what extent is that a constitutional violation if that delay occurs, or just part of voting. And so, you know, I, being sympathetic to voters, I want to say, wait a second, if the local government says you have until 72 hours before election day to request an absentee ballot, and that's timely, then you think, well, why can't voters rely on that? If, as long as I request by 72 hours, I ought to be able to vote by absentee. But if it's unrealistic to think that that request is going to be meaningful, maybe it's a fake deadline. And maybe the government should make what seems like a harsher deadline for saying you've got to request your ballot 2 weeks ahead of time if you've got any chance of casting it on time. But it's more realistic, so it doesn't give voters a false hope. So now I'm afraid we're going to have so much legislative paralysis, we're not going to get sensible rules between now and November, and then litigation comes along to try to improve rules. But you know, should the judicial response to a lawsuit of this nature be to change the date by which the absentee ballot is due, which is what the plaintiffs want? Maybe the remedy should be the date that the application is due, to give the system more time to handle the ballot up front. I don't know.
I would say, you know, what Ned's described just shows what I call in this new paper, the fragmentation of authority. So it wasn't clear in Wisconsin or in Ohio who had the authority to delay the election, who could change the rules. And you layer on top of that polarization over these questions where, you know, vote by mail shouldn't be, I think, so politicized, given that Republicans have used it very successfully in the past and in current elections. So you have and then you have judicialization on top of the polarization. And you have this kind of weak protection for voting rights in the Constitution itself. And so it's not clear, you know, so there are so many unanswered questions. Ned ran a kind of a roundtable simulation exercise a few weeks ago about all the things that could go wrong related to the counting of votes in the Electoral College. And it was amazing just how many things are unknown and uncertain. And so, you know, whatever we can do to reduce uncertainty and to enfranchise voters and making sure that eligible voters have a path to the ballot, that's what we need to be working on now. And uncertainty can be disenfranchising. I think that's an important point, right? It's not, people on the left often are talking about voter suppression. And I've said, you know, incompetence is more likely to cause you to lose your right to vote than voter suppression. But confusion is also high up on the list, and changing rules and uncertainty. And here, COVID is causing this external shock to the system, which raises this uncertainty, right? It's nobody's fault, right? It's not the Secretary of State of Ohio's fault or the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections fault that all of a sudden people can't safely walk into a polling place. But this is what everyone has to deal with right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say too, obviously here in Ohio, I think Professor Foley, to your point about the deadline when you can request an absentee ballot is just logistically impossible when you also have to make sure that that ballot, if you're going to mail it back in, is postmarked the day before the election. So in Ohio, you could request an absentee ballot up until noon on Saturday before the election, but needed to get that in the mail, filled out, and then postmarked by that next Monday. Which is just, you know, even under normal circumstances, not likely to happen given how long it takes for mail to go one direction and the other. But certainly raises a lot of difficulties when you're working with a postal service that is overburdened and underfunded. So I have a couple of questions in the queue. Some of them are super state specific, so I'll probably just type the answers to those. But one of the questions was about what you do when you're stuck in a state where the state Supreme Court, if that's your sort of court for last resort, or your other federal judges are obstructing the implementation of any type of more inclusive voting methods, where your remedies lie then. I assume the answer is in legislative advocacy work. But if we are seeing this sort of obstruction in going through litigation, where there are other places to turn for advocates to ensure that voters actually have an accessible and safe path to the ballot box?
Well, I guess I would say as a preface to answering that question, we need to think of what our standard is for judging adequate opportunity to vote this year. Because I'm hopeful that we'll pull this off and have an election that we can say democracy actually worked despite this acute threat of the COVID that Professor Hassan appropriately said is nobody's fault. So, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think if we have the political will to address some of these issues, we can pull it off. I don't think it's guaranteed that we're going to be successful because I think partisanship can get in the way and we may have political paralysis that prevents us from getting the money and the other things that we need to do. But in order to evaluate either the success or failure of our own democracy, we need a measure, a standard of success. It can't be perfection. We've never had a perfect election, even in a pre-COVID world, and it's not going to be this time. So what is good enough? What does that mean? That can't be my candidate won, right? This is about the process and the integrity of the process, again, as Rick mentioned. So what is adequate integrity? And what is genuine opportunity to vote mean in connection with adequate integrity? Sometimes I don't think we fully have figured that out and we have conflicting visions. Then the question is, as Rick said, is will the courts fulfill that vision? The courts, as his paper, it's an excellent paper, I've had the opportunity to read it, are doing a pretty good job, at least at the lower courts level, as he said. Again, it may not be perfect, but our judicial system, even the Supreme Court, may be willing to backstop an adequate opportunity to vote if we can only sensibly define it. But if we try to hit a home run or a grand slam when all we need is a single, again, we may get pushback. So again, there's different forms of overreaching, and one is philosophical overreach about what our conception of democracy is. So I don't want to answer the question of whether to go to court or go to a legislature until I know it is what we're asking for.
So I'm fascinated by the question because it just shows the American mindset that we've judicialized our election law so much. It's like, we have to run to court. And I'm not saying it's wrong to go to court, but this is how things are structured, that when voting rights are not adequately protected by the process or the legislative process moves too slowly, we go to federal court. And, you could contrast it to the way most other advanced democracies run their elections. They have national nonpartisan election administration. In South Korea, they were not litigating over how to conduct their national election. They had a national election board that figured out, well, how are we safely going to conduct this election? And they put in place all kinds of measures, and they had high turnout and a successful election, and people were not disenfranchised. So we're so dysfunctional as a country in terms of thinking about voting rights in this fragmented, piecemeal way where we rely on the courts. If you go to federal court and it doesn't work, well, maybe you can go to state court. Doesn't work, go to the legislature. You don't like that? Go to your Secretary of State. Maybe your county election board can do something. One of the things I think is fascinating is that the Supreme Court's order in the controversial Wisconsin case said that any ballots that were postmarked by Election Day but received by 6 days after would be counted. So if something's, and so the date of the election was the 7th. So if a ballot was postmarked on the 8th, you couldn't count it. Well, what about blank ballots? Blank envelopes, I should say, that don't have a postmark or where the postmark date is illegible. And the Supreme Court didn't say anything about that, and counties reached different decisions. Some counties decided to count ballots that came in without a postmark or without a legible postmark, and others did not. And, had the election been close, we would have had even more litigation over what the right rule was. And, the Supreme Court just was silent on this question. And it just shows you how piecemeal things are. And so there are lots of avenues. I guess that's a good thing if you're an advocate. There are lots of avenues to try to get what you want, but it also means there are lots of places where your things can be blocked. And it means that if you are in a highly polarized place, I think Wisconsin, there's going to be constant fighting and churning. And by the time the cases get to the highest courts, they're completely politicized, and we're no longer asking the question, how can we ensure that all eligible voters, but only eligible voters, will be able to easily and safely cast a vote that will be fairly and accurately counted? I mean, that should be the whole ballgame, whether you're a Democrat, Republican, third party, or no party.
Agree. Thank you. I got another question in the chat box, and it was not a plant, but it actually leads in very perfectly to the question that I was going to ask next. So I will read it out loud. It goes back to Professor Foley, a point that you made about the backup blank ballots that overseas voters can use. So the question is, besides employing the procedure for overseas voters who do not get their ballots, what other measures would you recommend as a backup if local elections officials cannot get absentee ballots that were properly requested to voters in time? Yes, it would be preferable to fund local election officials early enough so that there is not this backlog. But what if your legislation does not plan for the backlog? What are your options? And if a lawsuit is the only option, when would such a suit be ripe?
Yeah, great question. Well, even before we think about lawsuits, I want to give Professor Hassan credit for this great phrase, which is flatten the absentee ballot curve. And if I get it wrong, he'll correct me. But the concept is that voters on their own should request an absentee ballot as soon as they possibly can to avoid this crunch, right? I mean, we all are procrastinators by nature. I am, certainly. But we don't have to wait till the deadline to request an absentee ballot. Now, again, states are different. In some states, you can't do it yet. But in other states, you already can for November. So if you know that you want to vote absentee, or if you're a voting rights group trying to encourage turnout among your community, send the request as soon as you can now, if it's possible, so that you don't have to rely on litigation in the event that they didn't give you the ballot that you requested in September or October. So that's a kind of a self-help remedy at the early stages of the process that doesn't require anybody to get any more money, and it facilitates allowing the local officials to process that now. You don't have to cast the ballot now, you just request it now if you can. Then there will be this question about it. Let's say you get the ballot and you're going to rely on our postal system, which is very fragile, which we should talk about. When do you actually put it in the mail? Again, don't wait till that last minute, because the postal system is going to get overloaded this year. So even without litigation, I think individual voters and organizations that support voters have to think, intelligently and proactively in this regard. But if necessary, there may be forms of judicial remedies to supplement the process. And I think, just like Rick said, I would sue now. If you really think that a judicial imposed version of an emergency backup ballot should be available, it's better not to spring that on a court at the last minute. It's better to pave the way for that relief through expert depositions and statistics and so forth over the course of this summer, and get a conversation going about it. I'm not guaranteeing that it would win. I think it would get pushback, but then you could talk about, well, why are you suing, and what does narrow tailoring mean in this context? I would not try to wait until there's a failure to remedy. That'd be my advice there.
I agree with all that. I would add one other thing, which is that in our report, Fair Elections During a Crisis, again, you can Google that and read the whole report and the 14 recommendations. In that report, we say that there should be a variety of mechanisms for voting in November available to voters. Some voters are not going to be able to vote by mail because of disability. Some voters are not comfortable voting by mail. What if there's problems with the Postal Service? We need to have those in-person voting sites available for people to vote. Maybe they're going to have to wait hours to vote if they're not well staffed. But we need a variety of mechanisms in order to ensure voting. So I would not, unless you're a state that already has perfected all mail balloting, and even in those states there are means by which you can vote in person. Unless you're a state that's already done that, there must be an in-person alternative that is safe for voters. You know, I'm kind of haunted by the pictures of the voters in Milwaukee lining up for hours with their masks on. And, you know, it was like this was foisted on them. And, you know, the right thing to do in the midst of the pandemic was to not have voting in that way. But we don't know what November is going to look like. We don't know if there's going to be a second wave. We don't know what the postal system is going to look like. We need to have alternative mechanisms. So what does that mean now? It means pushing your election administrators who are planning now, your secretaries of state, your county election boards, plan now for both absentee balloting options, no excuse absentee balloting, and for in-person voting options for those who can't or are uncomfortable voting by mail.
Yeah, and I agree completely. I just add one thing. I worry about the idea that in-person voting in November will be multiple hours of wait time. I mean, I think there's a reason to be fearful of that, but you know, my conception of adequate opportunity is, you know, maximum of an hour or so waiting at the polls. I think when you get to wait times of 2 hours or longer, you're really abusing the voter, and you're really taxing the concept of enfranchisement. You're imposing a kind of a poll tax in terms of time spent at the polling place. So, you know, and as much as I'm worried about the absentee ballot side of things for reasons we've been talking about, including the Postal Service, most of our poll workers historically have been elderly, seniors who are going to be fearful about serving in November, as they were. The Chicago example or Illinois example that Rick mentioned is a really important point. And so if we're preparing properly for November, we've got to figure out both sides of this equation. And the in-person side is just as fragile as the absentee side. And the idea that people are going to be social distancing in line in the snow, maybe in November for 5 hours in Detroit or Philadelphia or Milwaukee again is just, you know, it's one thing to stand in line in April in Milwaukee. It's another thing, you know, on a cold, rainy November day. So
I think this points out the real difficulty that election administrators have. Before COVID-19 hit, those who are experts in turnout, and I'm not one of them, but I listen to them, were saying we're going to have a turnout tsunami, right? People are going to, because people love Trump, they hate Trump, people are going to show up and vote in this election. Now, turnout might be up, turnout might be down. Turnout might be mostly by mail. People might show up at the polling place because they have problems. How are you going to staff that? How are you going to figure out what you need to do? And so well-intentioned election administrators are in a very tough spot right now if they're trying to plan for the fall. Just like university administrators don't know if their students are coming back to the dorms yet or not. You know, we don't know where the voters are going to be in November. And we don't know how many of them there's going to be. And let's not forget voter registration, right? Normally voter registration right now, huge drives going on, knocking on doors person to person. There are 39 states that have online voter registration, which means there are 11 that don't. And a lot of those places that don't use things like, you know, the DMV, which might be closed to register voters. Fortunately, there is the equivalent of the FWAB for registering to vote in federal elections. There's a postcard you can use. So there is a way to register to vote everywhere with this postcard. If you do have a printer and you have a stamp, you can register to vote in the elections in November, no matter where in the United States you live.
I think the point specifically that it's not just about making sure that the vote by mail system is accessible and also logistically feasible, but also in protecting the ability for folks to vote safely in person is another challenge, not just in terms of the voters who can actually come in and vote, but also behind the scenes in terms of the administrators who then have to facilitate staffing, polling locations, et cetera. So one of the challenges that we saw in Ohio and certainly in Wisconsin in the lead up to our primaries, when it was either certain or not that we were actually going to hold them in person, was a huge dropout in poll workers who had signed up to voluntarily staff polling locations. primarily poll workers tend to be older in age and in more at-risk population subgroups for the coronavirus. So I'm wondering if you both can talk about what major challenges you think exist for not only in terms of staffing, but also what the behind the scenes apparatuses are that need to be in place so that they can actually count the number of ballots that are coming in, as well as just staffing the polling locations writ large.
So one thing to say is that I think we need to see a huge effort to sign up high school students, college students, young people to work as poll workers. Not only is it going to relieve the more at-risk populations, it's a great public service, and it's a patriotic act to work as a poll worker on election day. So I hope that lots of I know some states are reaching out on that. I hope that lots of states are reaching out and trying to do that. So that's one thing. But just going forward and thinking about how you plan in a situation like this, what you need to do is you need to plan for multiple contingencies. You need to have a plan B and a plan C. I mean, let's not forget, I wrote a book called Election Meltdown, which came out in February before we'd ever heard of coronavirus. And one of my biggest fears in there was a cyber attack on a Democratic city like Detroit in a swing state on election day. That could still happen, right? We still have to worry about election cybersecurity. We still have to worry about a hurricane or an earthquake hitting an election. Being an election administrator is a thankless job. One of the many tasks is figuring out what all the terrible things that could happen and why you could still enfranchise people, because we can't delay this election. This election is going to happen November 3rd. And so you've got to have those plans in place. Sorry, this is the problem of working at home.
No, Rick is exactly right about it's a really hard job to run an election because presidential elections every 4 years. So this huge surge in demand for a capacity that's not tested all the time. But we got to pull it off because it's going to happen one way or the other.
Great, thank you. So another question here that I presume applies not just to Wisconsin, which is what's asked about, but for other states. So in Wisconsin, state law prohibits employers or union representatives from assisting voters in marking or casting their ballots. How would that restriction be enforced using mail-in ballots? The same question arises with respect to abusive spouses bullying their mates into voting the right way when nobody is around to prevent it.
So one thing I can say is that I'm not generally a huge fan of absentee balloting because of the threat of ballot tampering and the risk of coercion or bribery. I think these are small risks. If you look at the 5 states that use almost completely all mail balloting for their elections, the rates of fraud or coercion or tampering are extremely low. I think if we have a huge expansion of absentee balloting across the country, that's not going to be uniformly the case. And so as much as I'm not in favor of these anti-voter fraud squads that we see popping up in some Republican states, I do think the message needs to come out that tampering with or unduly influencing how somebody votes is a problem, whether that's in a nursing home, a union hall, or it's a boss. It is very hard to police these things. The one thing I can say is that we know that criminals are generally not masterminds. And if you try and have a broad conspiracy where you say, everyone on the factory floor or everyone at this nursing home is going to fill out their ballots together and you're going to vote in this particular way in violation of state law, then that word is likely to get out, and there's going to be an investigation and someone's going to get in trouble. There are serious penalties for tampering with a ballot in a federal election. And so I think that the word needs to get out about that. And I think there's going to be so much. What I'm worried about is, Trump makes these unsubstantiated claims of voter fraud. The left pushes back and says, oh, there is no fraud, when in fact, it's rare, but it does happen. Right now in Paterson, New Jersey, there's a controversy brewing about an election where it looks like there were 600 tampered ballots that may have affected the outcome of an election. And so we do need to be on guard against these things. It's a small risk, but it's a real risk. And I think it's a bigger risk in places that don't have a history of enforcement of absentee ballot rules, because absentee balloting is so rare.
Yeah, and I think this relates to an aspect of your previous question that we can spend a little more time on, which is you refer to the behind the scenes or back end process. I think we need to be as concerned about what happens after the polls close and the counting of ballots occurs. I mean, the casting of ballots is crucial. That's step one. We've got to pull that off so that people have an adequate opportunity to vote. But then to go to Rick's point about confidence, ultimately the whole system depends on voters thinking that the result is fair and that the losing candidate is willing to accept the result despite the loss. And that requires a perception that the system has integrity. And for that to work, you need the casting process to function properly and the counting process to function properly, and the sense that the ballots are counted fairly. They don't have to be counted immediately on election night. We're not going to probably have an answer on election night this year. That's okay. That's not...
Unless it's a blowout.
Yeah, a blowout, right. But we have to be prepared for the possibility that the count will take longer than normal because of COVID-related effects, including more absentee voting. But what we need is closure eventually and acceptance of the result. And I'm worried that some of the kinds of things that Rick was just talking about could, even if things go fairly smoothly at the casting process, thank goodness, wrongful allegations about fraud or just perceptions about the system being rigged or what have you could destabilize the counting environment. I hope not, but I think we need to be concerned about that as well as we prepare for November.
Thank you. So I want to sort of delve into something that we've touched on in a couple of answers, which is ensuring that we are restoring faith in the electoral process and certainly in the outcomes of those elections. And you both have mentioned President Trump certainly has become very vocal about the downsides of vote by mail, talking about how it is an opportunity for Democrats to steal the election. We've got folks here in Ohio who are fundraising and political emails by raising dubious claims about Democrats trying to block all in-person voting. And I'm curious if you both can talk about what damage can be done by talking points like that, and on the other side, what we can do to combat that sort of angle, which I think obviously erodes faith in the electoral process, particularly when you're talking about expanding vote by mail. Professor Hassan, I think you were right to point out that there are a number of communities who have a very long-standing tradition of voting in person. There's a lot of distrust in the mail system. So I'm just curious if you can spend a little bit more time talking about the damage that that sort of speech does and what we can do as advocates in this space to combat that sort of language.
So I wrote an entire chapter of my book, Election Meltdown, about rhetoric and how it's dangerous when people talk about stolen and rigged elections. And I took a lot of heat from the left when saying it's not just Donald Trump, it's also Stacey Abrams and the kind of language she used to talk about her election, which I think there was a lot of unfairness in that election. But to talk about herself as the winner of the election, or to say that the system is rigged so that Kemp was not the legitimate governor of Georgia, is very troubling. And so I think we need to call that out when we see that kind of language, and we need to come forward with facts. And I think a big part of this falls on those of us in the public sphere and in the media to educate the public about what are the facts. Is there fraud? When is there fraud? When are there problems with elections? And as Ned mentioned, delay in election results are to be expected when you have a flood of absentee ballots. That's not a sign of fraud. And so we've been doing a lot of work, this committee that came out with the Fair Elections During a Crisis report, in trying to educate the media so the media will educate the public on the fact that There's going to be a delay in reporting. And there was just an op-ed in yesterday's New York Times by Ellen Weintraub and Kevin Cruz making the same point. There's going to be a delay in the reporting of the results of the election. If it's close, that we might have to wait a week. And there's going to be opportunistic statements. You know, you can imagine Trump's ahead in Pennsylvania on election night. 5 days later, Biden's declared the winner, and Trump says, no, he's the winner. And, you know, there's a whole fight over that. We need to be level-headed. We need to stick with what the facts are. There's going to be some percentage of people who are going to believe that the election is stolen. I mean, let's think about this. In November, 40-something% of the population, at least, is going to be extremely disappointed in the results of the election, and is going to think that a catastrophe is falling upon the United States with the election results, because we're so polarized. In that atmosphere, it's going to be very tempting for the losers to believe that something untoward happened in the election. And so we really need to come forward with facts, and we need to set down our markers now. How do you know when there's a fair election? What are you looking for? And so one of the things that election administrators need to do is be as transparent as possible. Here's how many ballots came in. Here's how many ballots were counted. This is what's remaining to do. This is how long we think it's going to take, and give detailed updates all the time. Unlike what we saw in the Iowa Democratic Caucus, for example, where you know, there was silence, and then there was you know, vague statements, and then there were 2 days where nobody knew what was going on. And so that's really the wrong way to instill confidence.
And the more bipartisanship we can have on this, the better. It may be idealistic, but for example, Secretary of State LaRose here in Ohio and Secretary of State Benson in Michigan have teamed up to do events. They did a great event out in the University of California, Irvine together. They're going to do a web-based event sponsored by Ohio State the end of next week that people can Google about on the Ohio State webpage. And so, you know, it is possible for Democrats and Republicans actually to agree on things. Not every, you know, there's a lot of news around President Trump and some statements that are made, and they're unfortunate. But whenever we see positive elements of bipartisanship, like Secretary LaRose and Secretary Benson getting together, we should, you know, herald that as a positive, because ultimately you need bipartisan acceptance of results. You know, Kentucky is an interesting example. They had a gubernatorial election last year where the incumbent governor hoped that his own party that controlled the legislature might help him basically ignore the count of the popular vote and just reinstall him. But even his own side wouldn't accept that. That was too much. You know, at some point, the numbers are the numbers. And as long as both political parties accept that basic premise that, you know, the numbers are the numbers, we'll probably be okay. You know, yes, there'll be some noise and this and that, but, you know, I still think most Americans, regardless of party background, want to run fair elections where the voters themselves get the choice. That should be the standard.
I think you're probably right. I will challenge a little bit, I think, and this is a question that was raised in the Q&A box, that I think, well, maybe it's just because I'm more cynical given my work in the political space, but I think that, you know, President Trump is working fairly hard at destabilizing the trust in those numbers. So I think you're right that voters probably writ largely agree, and they do. Polling numbers suggest that voters overwhelmingly support expanding vote by mail, ensuring that voters have the ability to safely cast their ballots. The story is quite different, obviously, in what legislators themselves are willing to pass in states like Ohio, for sure. So I'm just curious about what damage you think is being done, and whether there is actually a wholesale buy-in to the numbers piece in terms of accepting the election results.
Well, that, you know, if we lose our basic, you know, there's law is important, but norms are important too. And part of the report that Professor Hassan's talking about, which is this great report, talks about norms and culture, not just our legal rules. You can't have a democracy without some shared premises on both sides. And if we lose that because one side gives up on democracy, you can't have a two-party system if only one party is going to play a two-party game. Yeah, right. But I have not lost confidence in our capacity. We are facing stresses, and we were going to have these challenges before COVID hit. Rick is absolutely right. Because of impeachment, because of other factors, because of Russia, we were already kind of had lost our moorings a little bit in our standards. This is why I've got a paper out called How to Tell Whether an Election Result is Valid. But we also have a history to draw upon where we have run elections and we do have standards. So there's no guarantee of success this fall. It is not it's not a self-driving car. We the people have to drive this car, and we could crash it into the ditch. I hope not, but we can also run it properly. It's going to be up to us collectively. And I hope we pull it off. I really hope we do.
Well, I can't improve on what Ned said. All I can tell you is that in the chat box, I've put links to the Fair Elections During a Crisis report, as well as my paper that I posted today. I agree with Ned. I'm hopeful. Maybe optimistic's not the right word, but I'm hopeful about the fall. There are enough people that want to do the right thing, and I hope that despite the rhetoric of President Trump about fraud and that some of his followers follow, that there are enough responsible people out there that we can actually ensure that Democratic, Republican, third party, and no party voters, if they're eligible to vote, will be able to safely and in a healthy way cast a ballot that will be fairly and accurately counted in a careful and expeditious way.
Well, thank you both so much. We are 2 minutes past time, so I want to thank both Professors Foley and Hassan for joining us. Thank you again to the lawyer chapters across the country who helped boost up our numbers for this event. Really glad that we could bring this to all of you. I hope that you are all hanging in there and staying healthy. Thank you for joining us. I hope you all have a good rest of your day, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Katie, really appreciate it.
Thanks.